Hello, welcome to the book report. Got an okay book. I didn't really read the whole thing, but there were some fun pieces to it. So I'm going ahead and doing a report. The day it finally happens. Alien contact, dinosaur parks, immortal humans, and other possible phenomenon with the M crossed out by Mike Pearl. So I found this a very uneven book. Like I said, I did not read every section. Basically, it's got a couple dozen sections, each covering one, impossible or, unlikely event and how likely it is, what would bring it about, what are the odds, and what would the ramifications be. And some sections are very well researched and thoughtful and interesting, and other sections are not researched at all and not thought out very well, and just a waste of time, to the point where certain topics that I was pretty familiar with I just started skipping, right? But you know I could recommend this to somebody who just wants an interesting distraction, some things to think about. So let's get to the first reaction. Let's see. Contradictory and lazy analysis. Okay. Okay. So philosopher Peter Asaro, spokesman for the campaign to stop killer robots, shares my fear. This is about a singularity taking over the world, or AI taking over the world. The singularity risk that people worry about, the threat of computers becoming so powerful that they'll outsmart us and enslave us, doesn't make much sense on closer inspection. But Asaro pointed out to me that true artificial intelligence is nonetheless pretty scary if AIs start running companies with, quote, no individual and no group of people able to really guide them anymore, close quote. That paragraph, I'm sorry, basically says, so, you know, um, real artificial intelligence, the what does he say? Doesn't make much sense on closer inspection. So, hard AI, real AI, or artificial general intelligence, as some people say, is not the threat that people think it is, and isn't as big a deal as people think it is. And yet, but here's an example of how it could be a big deal. It's like, so you're actually directly contradicting yourself in the very next sentence. And I think it is. I think it is a real threat. I think closer inspection does actually lead you to be even more afraid of possible bad outcomes, and that much more motivated to contribute to or encourage people to be very careful as we approach AGI, or artificial general intelligence. So I thought that section was particularly lazy. He has another section titled "The Day the U.S. Completely Bans Guns," and then uses Australia as an example. Well, Australia did not ban guns. This title is horrendous. It should be "The Day the U.S. Gets Serious About Gun Regulation," because Australia did not ban guns. They regulated them, and they said, hey, there's no reason for people to have military grade equipment at home, right? But they did not ban guns, and the U.S. never will either. But we do need more enforcement of existing gun laws, and I think we do need new laws and regulations. I mean, over half of all gun deaths are suicides, something that he I think he did mention it, but he didn't push on the real solution, which is universal background checks, universal training, and strongly enforced storage laws, right? You can't just leave a loaded gun laying around so that your, distraught teenage son can grab it and, uh, gun storage, I think, is one of the biggest issues, and it seems like every week, if you search for it, you can find every week a tragic story of some woman with a loaded gun in her purse, or some guy with a loaded gun in the car, and some 3 or 4 or 5-year-old finds the gun, starts messing with it, and boom, somebody's dead or severely injured, right? And there's no excuse for that. Gun storage, come on. It's really basic stuff here. All right, so and then here's one about the day the entire internet goes down. And there's really nothing to read here. Just basically that even the scenario, again, it's a badly titled thing, because even his most extreme scenario, which would be very difficult to pull off, except maybe maybe a really large, well-funded organization with just the right hacks on just the right kind of equipment, maybe. Anyway, even his worst case scenario would not completely shut down the internet. So I think it's just too big. There's too many pieces. There's too many different bits of hardware and software. I think at this point, and then once Starlink is up and running with a significant number of users, you're going to have not just 2 or 3 ways to get data places. You're going to have 5 or 6 or 7, right? And OneWeb is coming up, right? So, I think we're going to have so many low latency internet connections in the near future that even this worst case scenario, which still doesn't bring down the whole internet, is going to become even harder, even more impossible. So, anyway, a section that I think, he kind of talks about that. Anyway, and then the last bit, this is the day the last slave goes free. A few years ago, I didn't really think about it too much. It's sort of like, a handful of slaves in Saudi Arabia that just outlawed it 20 years ago or something, But then last few years, I've actually been reading a bit more about it, and there really is more slavery than I knew. Although it is down, according to these numbers, it is down to about 0.5% of the global population, which is still way too many people, but on a historic basis is tiny, right? I mean, but hopefully we can get it to 0. But it's just heartbreaking. According to the most recent estimate from the International Labor Organization, the world's slaves are essentially divided into 25 million people being forced to do backbreaking work without pay, and 15 million in some sort of forced marriage, which is a little like being drafted to be a sex slave and an unpaid domestic worker at the same time. Consequently, 71% of enslaved people are female. According to the numbers provided by the ILO report, 0.0004% of male slaves are sex slaves. About 1/4 of all enslaved people are children. It's easy to think of modern slavery as something that afflicts far-off, relatively undeveloped society, but remember, this is probably happening in your city. So, in most places, slavery is very rare, but still happens, and but the end is in sight. In fact, I think that was one of the more interesting sections in there. Of course, it's an area that I don't know too much about. Like I said, I only really started researching, looking into it a few years ago. So maybe that's why it was one of the more interesting sections. But anyway, kind of a uneven but interesting survey of many unlikely events. Fairly well written, but like I said, some sections are pretty lazy, not very well researched or in depth at all, and then other sections are great. So, all right. Hope you have happy reading until next time.